The morning Beckett Greer led his riders down Route 9 he was not expecting to stop. None of them were. 8 men on heavy motorcycles, leather and engine noise, and the cold Tennessee air pressing against their faces like something the land had been holding all night, and finally decided to let go. The kind of men mothers quietly steered their children away from in parking lots. The kind of men store clerks watched a little too carefully. The kind of men the world had already made up its mind about long before any of them had a chance to speak. They had passed the yellow house on Birch Street for 8 months straight, every Tuesday, every Thursday, without fail. They had seen the boy every single time. But that morning, the first Tuesday of May, the porch was empty. And something about that silence hit Beckett Greer in a place no road had ever reached. He squeezed the brake without thinking. The column slowed behind him, 8 engines dropping in pitch like a held breath released too soon. He turned the formation around in the middle of Route 9 and brought them back toward the house with the peeling yellow paint and the broken second step and the porch where a 7-year-old boy had stood every week for 8 months barefoot in the cold, saluting them like they were the only thing in his world worth standing at attention for. What they found inside that house would change all of them. And no one in the town of Calder Falls, Tennessee would ever look at a biker the same way again. The town of Calder Falls sat between 2 low hills in the eastern part of the state like something the rest of the world had set aside and quietly forgotten. Population 4,200 according to the rusted green sign on Route 9, a number that had not been updated in 11 years. And that most locals suspected was no longer accurate and not in a generous direction. The storefronts along Birch and Main displayed permanent closed signs behind dusty glass. Fay Hollis still ran the diner on Maple Street, still served coffee and pie on weekday mornings, but only because she refused to retire on principle, and because she suspected the building itself might simply collapse if she stopped opening the door every day at 5:30. The grain elevator at the edge of town had been silent for 3 winters running. Its shadow still fell across Route 9 every afternoon, long and thin like a finger pointing toward something nobody wanted to look at. Calder Falls was the kind of place that young people left and old people stayed in. Not because they loved it especially, but because at a certain point the energy required to leave begins to cost more than it returns. And so they stayed. They stayed and they watched things slowly close and slowly rust and slowly become the way things had always been. Silas Dawson had never thought about leaving. At 7 years old, the world beyond Calder Falls existed for him the way most large things exist for children of that age. As a concept. Vivid in television screens and library books and the smell of distance that sometimes arrived on a strong east wind, but not yet as anything he had reason to move toward. His world was small and specific. The cracked sidewalk in front of Mabel Whitmore's yellow house on Birch Street. The garden that she could no longer properly tend. The lavender soap she kept by the kitchen sink that smelled like something safe. And the long gray stretch of Route 9 that ran past the front gate every Tuesday and Thursday morning like a promise the road kept to itself. Silas had been living with Mabel for 14 months. Before that, a group home in Knoxville. 2 months that left no particular mark except a quiet and permanent understanding that adults came and went and rarely stayed. The beds were clean. The food was adequate. The staff rotated on shifts and called him by his file number more often than his name, not out of cruelty, but out of the efficiency that institutions develop when they process too many children through too few hands. Before the group home, a hospital, a social worker with kind eyes and a practiced soft voice, and a set of facts that Silas had processed the way children sometimes process enormous things, in silence, without ceremony, alone in the dark, staring at a ceiling that did not belong to him. His mother had died when he was 5 years old. An accident on a county road 12 miles outside of Knoxville. Wet pavement. A truck that did not stop. The details had been explained to him once by a woman whose name he no longer remembered, and he had listened with the careful stillness of a child who already understood that understanding would not change anything. His father had never been located. There were no aunts, no uncles, no grandparents whose names appeared in any file. There was only the county system, and the county system had eventually produced Mabel. Mabel Whitmore was 71 years old and had never had children of her own. She had agreed to serve as an informal caregiver through an arrangement that Lorene Pace Calder Falls's social services coordinator had quietly organized when the group home situation became untenable. Mabel was not a licensed foster parent. She was simply a woman with an empty house, a methodical kindness, and an old-fashioned conviction that children were not designed to sleep in institutions when there were willing neighbors nearby. She was not a wealthy woman. Her fixed income covered the utilities and groceries without much remaining. The math was tight, and it was getting tighter every month, though Silas did not know why and Mabel did not say. His clothes were second-hand, washed carefully and mended at the seams when they gave. His shoes were half a size too small by the time autumn arrived, and by winter they pinched badly enough that he had started walking on his toes without realizing it, the way the body quietly adjusts to discomfort when it learns that complaining does not produce solutions. Mabel had not yet found a way to solve the shoe problem. She had not found a way to solve several problems. But she fed him well. Beans and cornbread and canned peaches and garden tomatoes when the season allowed. She read to him at night in a voice that was steady and unhurried, and she kept the house warm, and she never once made him feel like a category of problem that someone had assigned her to manage. She made him feel like a boy who lived in a house where someone was glad he was there. That was not nothing. For a child who had learned by the age of 5 that the world was a place where people disappeared without warning, that was not nothing at all. It was Mabel who first noticed Silas's fascination with the motorcycles. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning at 7:15, the Ridgeline Riders moved through Calder Falls on Route 9. There were usually 8 to 12 of them, riding in a staggered two-column formation, the low, heavy sound of their engines reaching the house a full minute before the machines themselves appeared around the bend near the old grain elevator. They passed through without stopping. Calder Falls was not their destination, only a section of their regular route toward the county line, and within 2 minutes the road was quiet again, as if the sound and the men and the machines had been briefly borrowed from somewhere else and then returned. The first time Silas heard them, he ran to the porch in his socks. He stood at the top of the steps with his mouth slightly open and watched with an expression that Mabel, standing behind the screen door, could only describe as pure and undefended wonder. The motorcycles were large and loud and somehow beautiful in the way that powerful machines can be beautiful, purposeful, unhurried, moving through the morning with the confidence of things that belong exactly where they are. The men who rode them wore leather vests and heavy boots. Several had long beards and forearms dark with tattoo work visible even at 50 yards. Their faces were hard and weathered and marked by years that had not always been kind. What Silas did next surprised Mabel entirely. He raised his right hand to his forehead and held a salute, straight-backed, chin level, arm bent at the exact angle he had studied in the war documentaries Mabel favored on Sunday afternoons. He held it until the last motorcycle disappeared around the far curve. Then he lowered his hand, turned, and went back inside to finish his breakfast without any particular comment. Mabel stood in the doorway for a long moment, uncertain what she had just witnessed. She asked him at the kitchen table, "Why did you salute them, sweetheart?" Silas considered this the way he considered most things, slowly, with genuine attention, as though he wanted his words to be accurate before he let them go. "Because they are brave," he said. "They ride those big bikes and nobody bothers them." He picked up a piece of cornbread. "They are not scared of anything." Mabel did not correct him. She was not entirely sure he was wrong. The salute became a ritual. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning, without exception, Silas was on the porch at 7:10, 5 minutes early, already standing straight. He wore whatever he had slept in if there was not time to change. Bare feet on cold wood when the season allowed it, though it never required bare feet in any season that would have been safe for them. It did not matter. He was there and he saluted and then he went inside. He did not know yet that they had noticed him. He did not know yet what that would eventually mean. Beckett Greer had been riding motorcycles for 31 years and had led the Ridgeline Riders for the last 9 of them. He was 48 years old, broad-shouldered and unhurried in the way of men who learned long ago that urgency usually costs more than it earns. His beard was gray at the edges. He trimmed it once a month. His forearms carried 30 years of accumulated ink, names, dates, a shield from his army unit, a mountain range he had loved in a country he never wanted to return to, and underneath all of it in letters small enough to miss, unless you knew where to look, a single name: Liam. He had served 8 years in the United States Army, 2 deployments to Iraq, before coming home to Tennessee with a discharge that carried a story he never told. The record said assault on a superior officer. The record did not say why. Beckett had never corrected it. He had his reasons, and those reasons belonged to someone else. He came home. Spent 14 years as an automotive technician. He had been married once. He had been a father once. Both of those things had ended, one quietly, and one in a way that was not quiet at all, and underneath the accumulated ink on his left forearm, there was a name in small letters that he did not explain, and that people learned not to ask about. Liam. He said it was a name that mattered. The way he said it made people stop asking. He built the Ridgeline Riders from a loose circle of friends into something that functioned more than anything else like a family. Not a gang, not an organization. A family of men who had run out of families and found each other on the road instead. They were mechanics, veterans, construction workers, tradesmen. Virgil Coulter, 51, and the oldest full member, ran the only functioning repair shop in the county and kept half of Calder Falls' aging vehicles on the road through a combination of genuine skill and sheer stubborn refusal to tell a customer their car was not worth fixing. Jasper Farley, the youngest, at 39, taught automotive technology at the regional vocational school 3 mornings a week and had a reputation among his students for explaining things with uncommon patience. Wyatt Maddox had been with Beckett the longest and understood him the way that old friends understand each other, not through conversation, but through the accumulated evidence of years spent watching and choosing to remain. They wore leather and rode loud and had the kind of faces that made strangers step aside on sidewalks. They had learned to accept this. Most of the time it was easier than explaining. In-town conversations quieted when the Ridgeline riders walked into the hardware store. Mothers moved their children subtly behind them when the group rode down Main Street. At civic events and town gatherings, there existed an invisible perimeter around the group, tolerated, accommodated, never included. The assumption was consistent and required no words. Men like these were to be kept at a distance. Beckett had first noticed the boy on a Thursday in late September, a cold, pale morning with frost still silver on the grass and a sky the color of old tin. He had been leading the column around the bend near the grain elevator when movement on the porch of the yellow house caught the edge of his attention. A small figure, standing straight, right hand raised in a salute that was precise enough to be deliberate. He nearly slowed right then. Instead, he continued past, watching the boy in his left mirror until the house disappeared behind the far curve. "You see that kid?" he said to Wyatt at the gas station in Harlan County 20 minutes later. Wyatt had seen him. "Been there a few weeks at least," Wyatt said, filling his tank without looking up. "He always salutes. Always." Beckett had thought about that for the rest of the ride, and then in a less organized way for the rest of the week. On the following Tuesday he watched more carefully. The boy was there again. Same posture, same raised hand, same focused attention on the column moving past his gate. He could not have been older than 6 or 7. He was visibly thin. His clothes were worn in the way that clothes get worn when they are washed frequently but never replaced. His feet, Beckett noticed with a small tightening in his chest, were bare against the October wood. The third week, without any explicit discussion, the group's behavior began to shift. The riders slowed as they passed the yellow house on Birch Street. Some began raising a hand in return. Jasper had started giving a single long blast of his horn as he passed. The boys' salute in response grew stiffer and more deliberate. Practiced, improved, offered with greater ceremony. "He is studying it," Virgil said one afternoon at his shop. Voice floating up from beneath a Ford F-150. "Probably watches military footage." "Bare feet in February," Beckett said. Virgil rolled out from under the chassis and looked at him steadily. "That boy is showing us more respect than most people in this county have shown us in 9 years. That was the thing Beckett kept returning to. The invisible perimeter, the conversations that quieted, the sideways looks and the careful distance maintained by strangers who had formed their conclusions before he ever opened his mouth. And here was a 7-year-old boy standing barefoot on a Tennessee porch in the cold practicing a military salute for a group of men he had never met because as far as anyone could tell he had decided on his own that they deserved one. By March, all of them knew about the boy. Jasper had started calling him the General, and it had stuck with the natural ease of names that fit. Nobody had stopped. Nobody had spoken to him. But the column always slowed on Birch Street now, and there was always an acknowledgment before they moved on. On a Tuesday in late April, for the first time in all the months of the ritual, Beckett Greer raised his own right hand in a full and deliberate military salute as he passed the yellow house on Birch Street. A proper salute, the kind he had not given since Iraq. Silas Dawson's face for one unguarded moment broke into the widest smile Beckett had ever seen on a child. full and unrestrained, and gone again in an instant, replaced by the serious expression of someone trying to maintain proper saluting form. Beckett carried that image for the rest of the day. He carried it the way you carry things that have changed something inside you before you have had time to understand what changed or why. And then came the first Tuesday of May. The morning arrived with the generosity of a Tennessee spring that had decided to deliver on every promise it had been making for weeks. Warm air, bird song threading through the tree line on the ridge, the road still dark from overnight rain and catching the early light in long silver patches. Beckett led the column out of the lot behind Virgil's shop at 7 sharp. The engines settled into their familiar rhythm as they worked through the back streets toward Route 9. The approach to Birch Street had acquired a quality over the months, a low attentiveness, a sharpening of focus, a change in the nature of the ride that he had no language for, but recognized without difficulty. The porch was empty. He noticed before his mind had fully processed the image. His hand went to the brake involuntarily, and the column slowed around him in response, the riders reading his pace, the way they had learned to read it through years of formation, riding through years of trusting each other on the road. No figure at the gate, no small silhouette at the top of the steps, no raised hand. He scanned the house as they rolled past. The front door was closed. The porch light was off. The curtain in the front window was drawn. Nothing was structurally wrong with any of this, but the stillness of the scene had a quality he recognized. Something missing from a familiar picture, felt before it is identified. He continued on. They completed the route in the usual way. The conversation at the gas station was quieter than normal. Kid was not there, Jasper said, not addressing anyone in particular. Noticed, Wyatt said. Sick maybe, Virgil offered. Happens with kids. Beckett said nothing. On Thursday the porch was empty again. This time he pulled over. He did it without announcing it. Simply decelerated and turned onto the dirt shoulder 50 yards past the yellow house, cut his engine. The column read the stop and followed. 8 motorcycles pulling off Route 9 in a loose line. Engines going quiet one by one until only the birds remained, and the low sound of wind coming down from the ridge. What are we doing? Jasper asked. Checking, Beckett said. He swung off the bike and walked back up the road toward the house. The front gate was a simple latch. He pushed it open and walked up the path, noting the cracked board on the second step as he climbed. The gutters had pulled free from the fascia on the left side and hung at an angle. The side yard was visible from the porch, a small shed with a rusted wheelbarrow, a garden that had not been touched since the previous fall. He knocked on the front door, waited, knocked again more firmly. No answer. Wyatt had come up quietly beside him. Side window is open, Wyatt said, nodding toward the left side of the house. They walked around. The kitchen window was raised about 4 inches. Beckett leaned close and listened. Silence. Then something that was barely a sound at all. A breath. The careful, controlled near silence of someone who has decided not to be heard. Beckett spoke into the quiet. My name is Beckett. We ride past your house every Tuesday and Thursday morning. You salute us. Silence. You know who I am. A very quiet voice came through the window. So quiet that Beckett had to close his eyes to hear it properly, the way you sometimes have to close one sense to sharpen another. You are the one who saluted back. Beckett opened his eyes. Wyatt was watching him with an expression that held several things at once. Recognition, restraint, something underneath both that did not have a clean name. That is right, Beckett said. Can you come to the door, son? Long silence, then footsteps, small, careful, slow, the slide of a bolt. The front door opened 4 inches, and a face appeared in the gap. Thin, pale, green eyes ringed with the hollowness of a child who had not slept well, and possibly had not eaten in longer than a day. He was wearing a faded gray shirt, 2 sizes too large, and shorts that had been pants before someone had cut them at the knee when the fabric tore. Silas Dawson looked at Beckett Greer for a careful measuring moment. The way children look at adults when they have learned that adults require assessment before they can be trusted. "Where is the lady who lives here with you?" Beckett asked. Mabel got sick. His voice was steady. The control in it was the kind that costs something to maintain, the kind of control that children develop when they learn early that falling apart does not produce outcomes. "The ambulance came 2 days ago. She had to go to the hospital. Is there anyone here with you?" The boy shook his head. A single motion, left to right. No performance in it. Just the fact. "Have you eaten today?" A pause. 1 second too long. "I had crackers," he said. Behind Beckett, Wyatt exhaled slowly through his nose. The sound a man makes when he is working very hard to keep his composure, because the situation requires steadiness and not the thing he is actually feeling. "Peanut butter crackers," Beckett said, keeping his voice easy. "Jasper has got a bag in his saddlebag right now. He always does. Man is incapable of leaving the house without peanut butter crackers." From somewhere behind them on the road, Jasper's voice carried across the yard. "That is completely accurate." The door opened 4 more inches, then all the way. They sat on the porch, Beckett on the steps, Silas beside him, the rest of the Ridgeline riders leaning against the fence or sitting on their bikes with the engines off, and the morning all around them unhurried. Jasper had produced not only the peanut butter crackers, but a bottle of water and a sleeve of fig bars from somewhere in his saddlebag with the quiet resourcefulness of a man accustomed to long days on the road. Silas ate with the focused, deliberate attention of a child who had learned not to waste anything. He did not eat fast. He did not grab. He ate the way someone eats when they have known what it is like to not eat, and the memory of that absence makes every bite a thing to be respected. Beckett let him eat before asking a single question. He understood from some accumulated instinct that the boy needed a few minutes of simple, ordinary experience before he could tolerate being asked to explain himself. The sensation of food, the presence of people, the morning sun on a porch. Some things need to be allowed to settle before they can be spoken. The story came out in the order that children tell things, not chronological but by weight. The most important pieces first, the surrounding details filling in as trust accumulated. Mabel Whitmore had been managing a heart condition in the quiet and stubborn way of elderly women who regard troubling others as a personal failure. She had been short of breath for weeks. She had told no one. The ambulance had arrived on a Tuesday morning early enough that it came before the bikers had passed. 2 paramedics had taken Mabel out on a stretcher while Silas watched from the hallway in his pajamas. A neighbor 2 doors down, Mrs. Embry, had called it in after hearing Mabel fall in the kitchen. The neighbor had looked at Silas standing in the hallway and said she would check on him later. She had not checked on him later. She had gone home and taken a prescription sleep aid and had not thought about the boy again until Thursday. Laureen Pace had been notified, but a file number had been transposed somewhere in the chain. A 7 where there should have been a 9 and a callback had gone to a voicemail that would not be checked for 48 hours. These are the margins by which systems fail, not through malice, through the accumulated weight of too many numbers and too few people paying attention to what the numbers represent. Silas had been alone since Tuesday morning. He had eaten peanut butter crackers from an open sleeve in the pantry. He had opened a can of cold vegetable soup using the manual can opener Mabel kept in the second kitchen drawer, the heavy kind with the butterfly handles that require both hands and a technique he had watched her use dozens of times. He had spilled some of it on the counter and cleaned it up with a dish towel and put the towel in the sink because that was what Mabel did. He had slept on the couch because he did not like being in his room with the door shut when no one else was in the house. The dark felt different when you were alone in it. The sounds were different. Every creak in the walls had a weight to it that it did not have when Mabel was sleeping down the hall. He had not cried. Or if he had, it had been the way children sometimes cry when they have learned over time that crying does not produce outcomes, quietly, in the dark, without an audience. Beckett listened to all of it without interrupting. When Silas finished, a silence settled over the porch that was not the uncomfortable kind. It was the kind of silence that happens when several men are all thinking the same thing at the same time and none of them need to say it because saying it would reduce it. Virgil was studying the loose gutter section with a professional expression that communicated a private assessment of how long it would take to fix and a private decision that he was going to fix it regardless. Wyatt leaned against the fence post with his arms crossed, looking at the road with the focused attention of a man who was not looking at the road at all. "How long have you lived here?" Beckett asked. 14 months, Silas said. The precision of someone who has found that tracking time gives him something to hold on to. You have family somewhere else. Knoxville, maybe? No. The word occupied the air between them and stayed there without apology. It was not said with self-pity. It was said the way a child says a thing that has been true for so long that it has stopped requiring any emotion to accompany it. It was simply the shape of his life. Beckett looked at the boy beside him. The faded shirt. The two small shoes sitting by the door worn at the toe from being outgrown months ago. The careful self-possession of a child who had been managing himself for longer than any 7-year-old should have to. He thought about 8 months of Tuesdays and Thursdays. He thought about the salute, precise and practiced and entirely genuine, offered to a group of men the rest of Calder Falls had quietly decided to keep at arm's length. And he thought about a name tattooed on his forearm that he could feel even now, even through the leather of his jacket, like something that had never quite healed and was not supposed to. "Why did you start saluting us?" Beckett asked. It was something he had wondered about since September. 8 months of wondering. Silas considered it, carefully, as though he owed his own thoughts the courtesy of getting them right. "Mabel told me you go past every Tuesday and Thursday," he said. "So I watched from the window the first time. All those big bikes going together, nobody rushing, a pause." He looked at his hands. They were small and very clean. Mabel had taught him to wash them before every meal, and he had continued doing it even when she was not there to remind him. Habits are the last things children let go of when everything else is taken away. "You did not race," he said. "You did not yell at each other. You just went together." He looked up at Beckett. "I thought that was brave." being big and loud and not trying to scare anybody with it. Nobody on the porch said anything. The morning was very quiet. The kids at school, Silas continued. His voice dropped slightly. Not in shame. In the frequency that children use when they are reporting something they find unjust, but have accepted as unchangeable. They say bikers are dangerous. Their moms tell them to stay away from people like you. He looked at Beckett with green eyes that were older than any 7-year-old's eyes should be. But I watched you every week for months and I never saw you do anything bad. You just rode past. He paused. I did not think it was right. People saying that when it was not true. Wyatt made a sound that was not quite a cough. Jasper was studying a point on the horizon with focused attention, his jaw set in a way that meant he was working hard to keep his face from doing something his voice would have to explain. Beckett Greer, who had spent the better part of 30 years being looked at sideways by hardware store clerks and crossed away from on sidewalks and watched carefully by strangers who had formed their conclusions before he ever opened his mouth. Beckett Greer sat on a crumbling porch in Calder Falls, Tennessee, next to a 7-year-old boy with worn shoes and a bag of peanut butter crackers, and felt something in him shift that he would not try to explain later even to Wyatt. Some things do not improve with language. Some things are better left where they land in the body, in the bones, in the part of a man that knows what matters before his mind has had time to form an opinion about it. He called Lorene Pace from the front yard, brief and direct, explained the situation and the address. Lorene's voice moved through surprise and then into the clipped urgency of someone shifting immediately into problem solving. I will be there in 40 minutes, she said. We will be here, Beckett replied. While they waited, Virgil retrieved a basic toolkit from his saddlebag and spent 35 minutes reattaching the gutter section along the full left run of the roof line, working from a stepladder that Jasper held steady at the base without being asked. Wyatt found a scrap of pressure-treated lumber in Mabel's shed and replaced the cracked board on the second porch step using 3 deck screws and a level he carried out of habit. The work was done without discussion, without assignment. Each man saw what needed doing and did it, the way men do when they have spent enough years together that coordination no longer requires conversation. Beckett sat on the porch with Silas and talked about motorcycles, how the engines worked, the difference between a cruiser and a touring bike, what it felt like to ride the open road at 6 in the morning when the fog was still sitting in the low fields along the river and the world was so quiet you could hear the tires reading the pavement beneath you like fingers across a page. Silas listened to every word. He asked questions with the focused precision he brought to everything, and Beckett answered each one in full because he understood without being told that this boy did not ask questions casually. Every question was an investment, an offering of trust. And trust once offered by a child who has learned not to offer it easily is not a thing you treat lightly. When Lorene Pace's county sedan pulled up to the gate 43 minutes later, she found 8 men in leather vests, a repaired gutter, a fixed porch step, and a 7-year-old boy leaning against the arm of the largest of them, explaining with evident and detailed authority the correct hand position for a military salute. Lorene stood at the gate for a moment before opening it. Mr. Greer, she said. Miss Pace Beckett said, appreciate you coming. She looked at Silas. Hey, buddy, I am sorry it took so long to get here. Silas looked at her with the careful, measuring green eyes that had been watching the Ridgeline riders from this porch for 8 months. the eyes that had decided long before any adult had given him permission to decide who in this world was worth trusting. "It is okay," he said. Beckett was here. Later that afternoon, after Lorene had taken Silas to her home for temporary placement, and the riders had finished the repairs they could manage in a single day, Beckett stood alone on the porch of the yellow house. The sun was lower now, catching the fresh lumber of the new porch step, making it glow against the older wood around it. He was about to leave when something caught his eye. The front door was still unlocked. Through the doorway he could see the kitchen, and on the kitchen counter the manual can opener with the butterfly handles still sitting where Silas had left it beside a half-empty can of vegetable soup. Beside it, a dish towel folded neatly in the sink. The precision of a child who maintained order because order was the only thing he could control. Beckett stood in the doorway and looked at that dish towel for a long time. Then he called Lorene. "Tell me what it takes," he said, "to do this correctly." She was quiet on the other end, the quiet of a woman who had spent 19 years watching people discover the distance between a good impulse and an actual commitment. Background check, home inspection, 30 hours of certification training, character references, a stable and appropriate living environment. She paused. "And patience, Mr. Greer. This does not happen in a week." "I understand that," Beckett said. "Tell me where to begin." He began that afternoon, and the Ridgeline riders did not need to be asked. But none of them knew about the envelope. That evening at Lorene's house, Silas could not sleep. The room was clean and warm and the bed was soft, but it was not his bed, and the ceiling was wrong, and the house made different sounds than Mabel's house, and the dark was the kind that belongs to places you have not yet learned to trust. He got up. He had brought his backpack with him. Inside it, 3 changes of clothes, a library book 3 weeks overdue, a photograph of a woman with dark hair and green eyes, a smooth gray river stone he had found behind Mabel's garden and kept because of the way it fit in his hand, and the envelope. He had found it that afternoon while the bikers were working outside and the house was loud with hammering and the sound of a drill. He had gone to the kitchen to get a glass of water and noticed that the drawer in the hallway cabinet, the one Mabel always kept locked, was slightly open. The lock was old and had given way at some point, maybe when Mabel fell, maybe before. He had not meant to look inside. But children are observant in the way that small animals are observant. They notice what adults have stopped seeing because for children the world is still new enough to contain surprises, and not all surprises are good. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, no stamp. Inside were 7 letters handwritten on yellow legal pad paper and 3 printed bank statements with certain numbers circled in red pen. The letters were from someone named Travis Keene. Silas did not know who Travis Keene was, but he could read well enough. Mabel had made sure of that, and what he read in those letters made something cold settle in his stomach. The feeling was not new. It was the same feeling he had when the social worker with the kind eyes had explained about his mother. The feeling of understanding arriving before you are ready for it, like a guest who shows up at your door in the middle of the night and will not leave. The letters asked for money, every month. The amounts were specific. $300, $400, $350. And between the numbers there were sentences that Silas read slowly, sounding out the longer words the way Mabel had taught him. "You know I can make things difficult for you. I know the arrangement is not legal. One call to the state office and they will take the boy inside a week. You do not want that and neither do I. So let us keep this between us, Mabel. And in the last letter, the one dated just 3 weeks ago, a line that Silas read twice and then a third time, sitting cross-legged on the hallway floor with the cabinet door open and the sound of hammering on the porch outside. You know what I can do if you do not pay. I know you are keeping the boy. Silas did not understand everything in the letters. He did not understand what the bank statements meant or why certain numbers were circled. But he understood the feeling behind the words. He had spent 5 years learning to read the weather of adult behavior, the shifts in tone that preceded trouble. These letters had that quality. They felt like the dark. Not the ordinary dark of a bedroom at night, the other kind, the kind that has weight to it. He put the letters back in the envelope. He put the envelope in his backpack at the very bottom underneath the photograph of his mother and the river stone and the library book. He did not tell anyone, not because he had decided to keep a secret, but because he did not yet know who to tell. The world as Silas Dawson understood it at 7 years old was a place where the wrong word to the wrong person could change everything, and not always in the direction you hoped. Now lying in Lorraine's guest room in the dark, he took the envelope out again. He held it against his chest. He could feel the edges of the letters through the paper pressing against his ribs. He did not sleep for a long time. When he finally did, he dreamed of motorcycles and the sound they made when they slowed down in front of a yellow house. In the dream, the porch was not empty. In the dream, he was standing on it, feet bare, hand raised, and the column stopped, every engine going quiet one by one until the only sound left was the wind coming down from the ridge and the beating of his own heart. In the morning he woke early. He checked the envelope. It was still there. He put it back in his backpack and zipped it shut and carried it with him when Lorraine drove him to Birch Street to help with the repairs. And that afternoon, while Jasper showed him how to use a tape measure, and Virgil explained why you always cut lumber a quarter-inch long and never a quarter-inch short, Silas watched the road, not for motorcycles this time, for a car he did not recognize, for a man he had never met but whose handwriting he now knew by heart, for Travis Keene. He did not know when the man would come, but the letters told him that he would. And Silas Dawson, 7 years old, barefoot on a porch in Tennessee, carrying an envelope full of threats in a backpack full of everything he owned, understood with the clarity of a child who has already lost everything. Once that this time, when the trouble came, he would not be standing on the porch alone. This time he knew where the men who stopped were. Mabel Whitmore came home on the second week of June. Lorraine Pace drove her from the rehabilitation facility in Harlan County in the county sedan with the windows down because Mabel insisted that 6 weeks of hospital air had made her forget what Tennessee smelled like in summer. She was thinner than when she had left. Her hands trembled slightly when she reached for the door handle. The color in her face had the quality of someone who has been indoors too long, a grayness underneath the skin that sunlight alone would not fix. But her eyes were clear, and her voice was steady, and when she asked Lorraine to slow down as they turned onto Birch Street, it was not because she was in pain. It was because she wanted to see the house. Lorraine slowed the car to a crawl. Mabel looked through the windshield and did not speak for a long time. The gutters were clean and straight, reattached along the full roofline with new brackets that caught the afternoon light. The porch steps had been rebuilt entirely from fresh pressure treated lumber sanded smooth, and painted the same gray as the originals. The fence along the front yard was straight and firmly set in new concrete. The side yard shed had a new hasp on the door, and the garden was showing green in 6 careful rows. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, squash, planted with the methodical spacing of someone who understood soil and seasons. Lorene stopped the car at the gate. She did not say anything. Some moments do not benefit from commentary. Mabel sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap and looked at the house she had lived in for 37 years. And she pressed her lips together in the way that elderly women press their lips together when they are working very hard not to cry in front of someone they respect. She went inside. She sat at her kitchen table. The table was clean. The dish towel was folded on the counter beside the sink. Everything was in its place, and Mabel understood without being told that someone, probably the boy, had made sure of that before she came home, because he knew it would matter to her. She was quiet for a while. Lorene made tea and set it in front of her and sat across the table and waited. "When is the boy coming home?" Mabel said. Lorene explained the situation. Beckett Greer had filed for provisional foster care. The paperwork was moving through the system. Silas was staying with Lorene during the process, but he came to Birch Street every afternoon. Mabel nodded. She picked up the tea and held it with both hands, and Lorene noticed that the trembling was worse than it had been in the car. "I need to tell you something," Mabel said. But she did not tell her anything. She set the tea down and looked out the window at the garden and the repaired fence, and whatever she had been about to say retreated back behind her eyes into the place where she had been keeping it for 2 years. She said she was tired. Lorene helped her to bed and left. That evening, Silas came home. Lorene dropped him off at 4:30 with his backpack and a grocery bag containing a casserole that Virgil's wife had made. Silas walked up the new porch steps, slowly testing each one with the ball of his foot the way a child tests ice before stepping onto it. And when Mabel opened the front door and stood there in the frame, thinner and grayer and trembling, he did not run to her. He stood at the top of the steps and looked at her, and she looked at him. And what passed between them was not the kind of reunion that makes noise. It was the kind that happens in the body in the space between two people who have learned that the world is not generous with permanence, and who are both afraid to trust the fact that the other one is still here. Mabel held out her hand. Silas walked to her and took it. They went inside. That night Silas heard Mabel cry for the first time. He was lying on the couch, not yet ready to sleep in his own room again, when the sound came through the wall from the kitchen. It was not loud. It was the kind of crying that someone does when they have closed the door and turned on the faucet to cover the sound and believe they are alone. But the walls in old houses are thin, and children who have lived in institutions learn to listen through walls, because the sounds that come through walls at night are the ones that tell you what is really happening. He heard the crying, and then he heard the voice. Mabel was on the phone. He could not hear the words clearly, only the tone. A voice trying to hold steady against something pressing down on it from the outside. Not angry, not sad in the ordinary way. Afraid. Silas lay on the couch with his eyes open in the dark and listened to the shape of the fear in Mabel's voice, and the cold feeling that had settled in his stomach 3 weeks ago when he found the envelope came back heavier than before. He did not sleep. In the morning, Mabel was standing at the stove making oatmeal when Silas came into the kitchen. Her eyes were swollen, but her voice was normal, and she asked him if he wanted brown sugar or honey, and whether he had finished his library book, and whether he thought the tomatoes would be ready by August. She did not mention the phone call. She behaved as though the night had contained nothing unusual, and Silas understood that this was not deception, it was protection. She was trying to keep the dark things away from him, not realizing that he had been living alongside dark things for most of his life, and had already learned to recognize them by shape and sound and smell. He ate his oatmeal. He answered her questions about the tomatoes. And when she turned to wash the pot, he watched the back of her head, and noticed how thin her hair had become, and how the bones of her shoulders showed through the fabric of her housecoat. And he thought about the bank statements in the envelope with the numbers circled in red, and understood suddenly and completely why Mabel's fixed income never seemed to cover quite enough. Why the shoes were always half a size too small. Why she had not gone to the doctor when the shortness of breath started. Someone was taking her money, and the someone was the man named Travis Keene. The understanding did not arrive as a revelation. It arrived as a confirmation. Children in the system develop a sense for the mechanics of exploitation the way children in flood zones develop a sense for the mechanics of water, not through study, but through proximity. Over the next 2 weeks, Silas began to write. He used the notebook Mabel had given him at Christmas, a composition book with a black and white marbled cover and wide ruled pages. He had used the first 8 pages for drawings, trucks, and motorcycles, and a horse he had seen on television. The 9th page was blank. He began there. His handwriting was the handwriting of a 7-year-old. Uneven letters. Words that drifted up and down across the lines like boats on unsteady water. But the content was precise. He recorded dates, times, observations. June 14th. Mabel got a phone call at 9 at night. She went in the kitchen and closed the door. She was crying after. June 17th. Mabel went to the bank. She came back and sat at the table for a long time. She did not make lunch until 2. June 19th. A man came to the house. The man came on a Thursday. Silas was supposed to be at Lorraine's house that afternoon, but Lorraine had a meeting in Harland County and had asked Mabel to keep him for the extra hours. At 3:15, while Silas was sitting at the kitchen table working on math worksheets, a car pulled into the gravel drive beside the house. Mabel's reaction was immediate and involuntary. She stood up from her chair and looked at the window, and then at Silas, and then at the window again, and the sequence of those 3 glances told Silas everything he needed to know. The first glance was recognition. The second was fear. The third was calculation. "Go to your room, sweetheart," Mabel said. Her voice was calm. The calm was the most frightening thing about it. Silas picked up his worksheets. He walked to the hallway. He did not go to his room. He went to the hallway closet, the one with the louvered door that Mabel used for linens, and which had a gap at the bottom wide enough to see the kitchen floor and hear everything said above it. He sat in the closet with his knees drawn up, and his composition book on his lap, and a pencil in his right hand. The front door opened. Footsteps. Heavy. A man's voice. Not loud. That was the thing that surprised Silas. He had expected loud. He had expected the voice of a bully, the kind he recognized from the schoolyard, the kind that used volume as a weapon. This voice was quiet and easy, and almost friendly the way a voice sounds when the person using it knows they do not need to raise it because the threat is understood by both parties without being spoken. "Hello, Mabel. Looking good. House looks different. Travis Keene was 43 years old. He was of average height, average build, with thinning hair and a face that was neither handsome nor ugly, but simply present, unremarkable, forgettable. He wore a button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbows and carried himself with the easy confidence of a man who has spent a long time getting what he wants from people who are too afraid or too tired to refuse. He had been connected to Mabel through her son Gerald, who had died 4 years ago from liver failure at the age of 46 in a halfway house in Memphis. Travis and Gerald had served time together at a state facility in Middle Tennessee. After Gerald died, Travis had appeared at Mabel's door with condolences and a story about money Gerald owed him, and a quiet suggestion that it would be a shame if certain details about Mabel's living situation were to reach the state office in Knoxville. The details were simple and devastating. Mabel was not a licensed foster parent. Her arrangement with Lorene was informal, undocumented, and technically outside the boundaries of what the state permitted. If Travis made one phone call, the state would investigate. They would find an unlicensed caregiver with a heart condition, a house in disrepair, and an income below the county threshold. They would remove Silas. Mabel would be alone again. Travis did not want much, $300 a month, sometimes $4, sometimes $350. The amounts varied the way parasites vary their appetite, enough to sustain themselves, but not quite enough to kill the host. Mabel paid because she did not know what else to do. She paid with the money that should have gone to Silas's shoes, with the money that should have gone to her heart medication, with the money that should have made the difference between a pantry that was full and a pantry that was not. She paid, and she said nothing, and she kept the letters in a locked drawer, and she told herself that this was the cost of keeping the boy safe. Silas sat in the closet and heard all of it. He heard Travis tell Mabel that the repairs to the house were very nice and ask who had paid for them. He heard Mabel say that friends had helped. He heard Travis say that friends were wonderful things and that he hoped Mabel's friends understood that certain arrangements required discretion. He heard Mabel say she would have the money by Friday. And then Silas heard the sentence that he would write in his composition book that night, pressing the pencil so hard into the paper that it tore through to the page beneath. "If you do not pay by Friday," Travis said in his quiet, easy, friendly voice, "I will make the call, and after they take the boy, I will come back for what Gerald really owed me. You do not want to know what that number looks like, Mabel." The front door closed. The car pulled out of the gravel drive, and in the hallway closet a 7-year-old boy sat in the dark among the folded sheets and towels and wrote the date and the time and every word he could remember in letters that were uneven and sometimes misspelled and absolutely precise. He wrote, "The man's name is Travis Keene. He makes Mabel pay money every month. He said if she don't pay he will call someone and they will take me away." Mabel was crying after he left. "She don't know I heard." And below that in letters that were smaller and more careful than the rest, as though the act of writing them required a different kind of attention. "She is poor because of him. My shoes are small because of him. She got sick because of him." He closed the notebook. He came out of the closet and went to the kitchen where Mabel was standing at the sink with the water running and her shoulders shaking, and he walked up behind her and put his arms around her waist without saying anything. She startled. She wiped her face with the back of her hand and turned around and looked down at him with eyes that were red and wet and full of the helpless love of a woman who has spent 2 years trying to protect a child from something she cannot stop. "You okay, sweetheart?" she said. "I am okay," he said. She believed him. She had no reason not to. 3 days after Travis Keene visited the house on Birch Street, a gray sedan with Harlan County plates pulled up to Lorene Pace's office in the municipal building on Main Street. The man who stepped out was tall, narrow-shouldered, and wore a suit that was pressed with a precision that communicated something about the person inside it. His name was Warren Hadley. He was 56 years old. He was a senior field inspector for the Tennessee Department of Children's Services, based in Knoxville, and he had been assigned to review what his office described as an irregularity in a foster care application in Calder Falls. The irregularity was Beckett Greer. Hadley was not a cruel man. This is important to understand because what followed might suggest otherwise, and the distinction matters. He was a bureaucrat in the original and uncorrupted sense of the word, a man who believed in process, in documentation, in the careful application of rules that existed for good reasons, even when individual circumstances made those rules feel wrong. He had seen too many cases where good intentions had produced bad outcomes. Too many well-meaning adults who believed that love was sufficient qualification for raising a child. He had learned over 23 years in the field to trust the file more than the feeling, to trust the record more than the person sitting across from him. He sat across from Lorene in her small office and opened the file he had assembled during the drive from Knoxville. "Mr. Greer," he said. "Beckett Allen Greer, 48 years old, unmarried, no prior parenting experience documented, currently leads a motorcycle organization called the Ridgeline Riders." He looked up. "That is the equivalent of a motorcycle gang, is it not, Ms. Pace?" "It is a riding club," Lorene said. "They are not affiliated with any criminal organization." Hadley nodded in the way that people nod when they have heard an answer and catalogued it without accepting it. He turned a page. "Mr. Greer's military record shows an other than honorable discharge. The specific incident involved an assault on a superior officer." He looked at Lorene. "A physical assault, documented and adjudicated." "There were circumstances," Lorene said. "There are always circumstances, Ms. Pace. The record is the record." He closed the file. "I have scheduled a formal review hearing for 2 weeks from today. If the evidence supports placement with Mr. Greer, I will recommend it. If it does not, I will recommend the alternative." "The alternative," Lorene said. "The group home in Knoxville has availability. It is not ideal, but it is within protocol." He left the office. Lorene sat at her desk, staring at the file with the look of a woman who has just been told that doing the right thing and doing the correct thing are two different activities, and that only one of them has paperwork. She called Beckett that evening. Beckett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked one question. "What do I need to do?" Lorene told him. "Character references, documentation of stable income, completion of the remaining certification hours, evidence of community ties, and most importantly, an explanation for the military discharge that would satisfy a man who trusted files more than feelings." Beckett said he would handle it. Silas learned about the hearing on a Wednesday afternoon. He was at Birch Street helping Virgil replace a section of rotted fascia board along the back of the house when Lorene arrived to speak with Mabel. They went inside. The kitchen window was open. Silas was standing on a milk crate holding a measuring tape for Virgil, and through the open window he heard Lorene explain the situation in the careful, measured tone she used when she was delivering news. She wished she did not have to deliver. He heard the word Knoxville. He heard the words group home. He heard the word hearing, and he heard Mabel's voice very quiet say the sentence that would stay with him longer than any other sentence spoken that summer. I cannot lose him. Not now. Not after everything. Virgil was talking about fascia boards. Silas was not listening to Virgil. He was listening through the window with the total concentration of a child whose survival instincts had been activated by a single word. Knoxville. The place with the clean beds and the rotating staff and the file numbers instead of names. That night Silas lay in his room at Mabel's house. He lay in the dark with the composition book open on his chest, and he thought about the two threats pressing down on the house on Birch Street from two different directions. From one direction, Travis Keene. Who would make the call if Mabel did not pay? Who would bring the state down on this house and this woman and this boy? Not because he cared about any of them, but because their fear was worth $300 a month to him. From the other direction, Warren Hadley, who did not need Travis Keene to make a call because he was already here, already reviewing, already building a case that the file did not support what the heart demanded. And between them, in the yellow house on Birch Street, a 71-year-old woman with a bad heart and a 7-year-old boy with a composition book. Silas understood the trap the way a child understands a locked door, from the inside. If he told Lorene about Travis, Mabel would be exposed. The informal arrangement, the payments, the fact that she had hidden all of it. Lorene would be obligated to report it. The state would use it as evidence that Mabel's home was unstable. Hadley would add it to his file. If he said nothing, Travis would keep taking the money. Mabel would keep getting sicker. The shoes would stay small, the pantry would stay thin, and eventually the heart condition that she could not afford to medicate properly would do what Travis Keene could not. He was 7 years old. He was lying in a bed in a house that smelled like lavender soap and cornbread, and he was staring at a ceiling that he had memorized over 14 months, every crack and every water stain, and he was solving a problem that no 7-year-old should have to solve. He solved it the way he had solved everything else in his life, quietly, by paying attention, by writing things down, and by choosing who to trust. On a Friday evening in the last week of June, Silas Dawson walked 3 miles along the shoulder of Route 9 from Birch Street to the ranch house on the outskirts of Calder Falls where Beckett Greer lived alone. 3 miles is not a long distance for an adult. For a 7-year-old boy with shoes that are half a size too small walking on the shoulder of a county road in the failing light of a Tennessee summer evening, it is a journey. He carried his backpack, inside it the composition book, the envelope, the photograph of his mother, the river stone, everything he owned, because children who have been through the system learn never to leave their important things behind. You carry what matters because you never know which departure will be the last one. He arrived at 7:45. The sky was the color of a bruise, fading purple and yellow at the edges where the sun had gone down behind the ridge. Beckett's motorcycle was parked in the open garage beside a workbench with tools arranged in the order of a man who finds comfort in knowing where things are. Silas walked up the front steps and knocked. Beckett opened the door. He looked down at the boy standing on his porch with a backpack and pinched shoes and green eyes that were steady and serious and older than anything in them should have been. He looked past the boy at the empty road disappearing into the dusk. "Did you walk here?" Beckett said. "Yes, sir. From Birch Street." "Yes, sir." "That is 3 miles, son." Silas shifted the backpack on his shoulders. "I know the way," he said. "I watched the route from the porch." Beckett stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he stepped aside and let the boy in. They sat at the kitchen table. Beckett poured a glass of milk and set it in front of Silas and did not ask questions because he had learned that this boy spoke when he was ready and not before, and the worst thing you could do was rush him towards something he needed to arrive at on his own. Silas drank half the milk. He set the glass down. He unzipped his backpack and took out the composition book and the cream-colored envelope and placed them both on the table between them side by side with the careful deliberation of someone presenting evidence. "There is a man named Travis Keene," Silas said. His voice was flat, the voice of a child who has rehearsed this moment in his head many times and has decided that the most effective way to say it is to say it the way the sky is blue, as a fact that exists whether or not anyone is ready to hear it. He comes to the house. He makes Mabel pay him money every month. If she does not pay, he says he will call the state and they will take me away. She has been paying him for 2 years. That is why she does not have enough money. That is why she could not buy me new shoes. That is why she got sick. He pushed the composition book toward Beckett. I wrote down everything I heard, the dates and what he said. The letters are in the envelope. There are bank statements, too. Beckett did not touch the notebook immediately. He looked at the boy, at the small hands that had pushed the notebook across the table, at the green eyes watching him with the focused attention of someone who has placed everything they have on a single bet and is waiting to see if it was the right one. "Why did you bring this to me?" Beckett said. "Because I did not know who else to bring it to. If I tell Lorene, Mabel will get in trouble for hiding it. The state man will use it against her. Against you too, probably." The boy paused. "But I cannot let him keep taking her money. She is getting sicker because of him, and I cannot stop him by myself." He looked at Beckett with absolute directness. "You are the one who stopped when the porch was empty. You are the only one who stopped. I think you will know what to do." Beckett opened the composition book. He read the first page. The uneven letters, the dates, the observations. He turned the page. The entry about Travis's visit. The words pressed so hard into the paper they had torn through to the page beneath. He read, "She is poor because of him. My shoes are small because of him. She got sick because of him." He closed the notebook. He sat very still. The kitchen was quiet. The clock on the wall above the stove ticked in the steady, indifferent way that clocks tick when the world around them is rearranging itself. He looked at the boy sitting across from him, a 7-year-old who had sat in a closet and listened to a man threaten the only person in the world who mattered to him, who had written it all down, who had walked 3 miles on a county road at dusk, carrying everything he owned, because he had decided that the man who had saluted him back was the one person he could trust. "You did the right thing," Beckett said. "Come in here. You did exactly the right thing." Then he picked up his phone. The call went to Wyatt first. Wyatt called Virgil. Virgil called Jasper. Within 40 minutes, 4 men were sitting in Beckett's kitchen with the composition book and the envelope spread on the table between cups of coffee that none of them were drinking. The room had the quality of a command post. Focused. The energy of men who have identified a problem and are methodically determining how to solve it. Virgil knew a man named Art Bowen, a retired forensic accountant who had spent 22 years with the state comptroller's office before his knees and his patience gave out simultaneously. Art lived 40 minutes away in Harlan County. Virgil called him. Art said he could be there in the morning. Jasper had a contact at a legal aid office in Knoxville, a lawyer named Catherine Marsh who handled pro bono cases for elderly exploitation. She responded within the hour. Wyatt said very little. He listened. He studied the letters. He read the bank statements. And then he said the thing that none of them had said yet, but all of them were thinking. If we go to the police with this, Travis walks. Small town sheriff, no resources, his word against hers. We need the money trail. We need documentation that connects his account to her withdrawals. And we need it before the hearing because if Hadley finds out about this from anyone other than us, on our terms with evidence that is clean and complete, he will use it to bury the whole thing. Art Bowen arrived at 8 the next morning. He was 67, heavy-set with reading glasses on a chain around his neck. He sat at Beckett's kitchen table and spent 4 hours with the bank statements and the letters and a legal pad on which he wrote in handwriting that was small and precise. By noon, he had it. The pattern was not sophisticated. Travis Keene had not been creative. He had been consistent, which in financial investigation is worse than being creative because consistency leaves tracks. The withdrawals from Mabel's account corresponded exactly in amount and date to deposits in a checking account that Art traced through a series of requests to the bank's compliance department. $300, $400, $350. Month after month for 23 months. The trail was clean and unambiguous, and it led directly to Travis Keene. Catherine Marsh reviewed the file by phone that afternoon and confirmed that it met the threshold for felony extortion under Tennessee statute. She would file the complaint with the county prosecutor's office on Monday. Wyatt took the first watch that night, parked on the shoulder of Route 9, 50 yards from the yellow house. Jasper relieved him at 2 in the morning. Virgil took the dawn shift. Travis Keene came back on a Tuesday. He pulled into the gravel drive at 10:15 in the morning, the same easy, unhurried arrival. He walked to the front door and knocked. Mabel opened it. And behind Mabel, standing in the hallway, was Beckett Greer. Travis looked at Beckett. He looked at the leather vest and the tattoos and the broad shoulders and the expression on the face of a man who had carried a dishonorable record for 6 years, rather than tell a story that was not his to tell, and who was now looking at the man who had been bleeding Mabel dry for 2 years. Travis took one step backward. Beckett did not move. He did not raise his voice. He handed Travis a manila folder. Inside the folder was Art Bowen's report, 23 months of transactions, bank records, a copy of Catherine Marsh's complaint filed that morning, and a letter informing Travis Keene that any further contact with Mabel Whitmore would be considered witness intimidation. Travis read the first page. The easy confidence drained out of his face the way color drains from a sky before a storm, and what was left underneath was small and gray and entirely ordinary. The face of a man who had mistaken the weakness of others for his own strength, and who was now discovering the difference. He left without speaking. He was arrested at his apartment in Harlan County the following morning. The charges were felony extortion and elder financial abuse. Catherine Marsh noted in her file that the initial evidence had been gathered by the victim's 7-year-old foster child, who had maintained a written log of the perpetrator's visits and had preserved the original correspondence in a sealed envelope for 3 weeks before delivering it to a trusted adult. The boy's notes, she wrote, were more thorough than half the case files I have received from professional investigators. But Travis Keene's arrest did not solve the other problem. Warren Hadley received news of the arrest through the county prosecutor's office. He read the report carefully, and then he picked up the phone and called Lorene Pace. "Ms. Pace," he said, I have reviewed the prosecutor's filing. I understand that Mr. Keene has been charged and that Ms. Whitmore was the victim of a sustained financial exploitation. I am glad the situation has been resolved. However, he paused. The pause was the kind that bureaucrats use the way other people use punctuation. However, this development does not alter my concerns about the placement. If anything, it raises additional questions. Ms. Whitmore concealed a 2-year criminal victimization from her social services coordinator. The child was living in a household where extortion was occurring without the knowledge of the supervising agency, and the resolution was conducted not through proper channels, but through the independent action of a motorcycle club operating outside the oversight of this department. The hearing will proceed as scheduled, Ms. Pace. Lorene hung up the phone. She called Beckett. The hearing is still on, she said. Hadley is not backing down. He says the Travis situation makes it worse, not better. Silence on the other end. Then Beckett's voice. Steady, unhurried. The voice of a man who has decided something and will not be moved from it. Then we will be there, and we will bring everything. That night Silas sat on the porch of the yellow house on Birch Street. The evening was warm. The garden was green. The gutters were straight. The steps were solid under his feet. He had his composition book on his lap. He opened it to a blank page and wrote the date at the top. Below it, in the careful letters of a boy who had learned that words on paper carry weight that words in the air do not, he wrote a single sentence. The hearing is in 5 days, and I am going to tell them everything. He closed the book. He looked at Route 9 at the long gray stretch of road that disappeared around the bend near the old grain elevator. The road where the motorcycles came every Tuesday and Thursday. The road that had brought the only people who had ever stopped. 5 days! He did not know what would happen. He did not know if the words in his composition book would be enough. He did not know if a 7-year-old boy standing in a room full of adults could say the thing that needed to be said in a way that a man who trusted files more than feelings would hear. But he knew he would be there, and he knew he would not be alone. And for a child who had spent most of his life learning that people come and go and rarely stay, that knowledge was everything. The hearing was held on a Wednesday morning in the second week of July at the County Services Building in Harlan County, a 2-story brick structure that sat at the end of a parking lot bordered by crepe myrtles that had not been trimmed in 3 years, and a flagpole whose halyard clanked against the aluminum in the wind with the steady, indifferent rhythm of something that would continue long after everyone inside the building had gone home. The room was on the 2nd floor. Fluorescent lights, a long table at the front, folding chairs arranged in rows. The carpet was the color of oatmeal. The walls were bare except for a framed photograph of the governor and a clock that was 4 minutes slow and that nobody had corrected because in government buildings the correction of small inaccuracies is never anyone's specific responsibility. Warren Hadley arrived at 8:45. He carried a leather briefcase and a manila folder and the posture of a man who has prepared thoroughly and who regards preparation as a form of respect for the process he serves. He wore a charcoal suit. His shoes were polished. He set his materials on the front table with the organized precision of someone who has done this many times. Lorene Pace arrived at 8:50. She wore a navy blazer over a white blouse and carried a folder of her own thinner than Hadley's but assembled with the same care. Beckett Greer arrived at 9. He had considered what to wear for longer than he would have admitted to anyone. He owned 2 collared shirts. He chose the darker one. He wore it tucked in with a belt, and he had trimmed his beard that morning and cleaned his boots, and left his leather vest at home for the first time in 9 years. He sat in the front row of folding chairs and placed his hands on his knees and waited. Wyatt Maddox sat beside him, then Virgil Coulter, then Jasper Farley. They had come in Virgil's truck, not on motorcycles, because Beckett had asked them to, and because they understood without explanation that the sound of 8 engines in a county parking lot would not serve the purpose they were there to serve. They wore clean shirts, they sat quietly, they looked like what they were, working men, veterans, tradesmen. Mabel Whitmore arrived at 9:10. Lorene had driven her. She walked slowly, one hand on Lorene's arm, and sat in the second row behind Beckett. She was wearing a dress she had not worn in 4 years, blue with small white flowers pressed that morning with an iron she had heated on the stove because the steam function had stopped working long ago. Her hands trembled in her lap. She folded them together to keep them still. And beside her in a chair that was slightly too large for him sat Silas Dawson. He was wearing his best clothes, which were his only good clothes. A white button-down shirt that Lorene had bought for him the previous week. Dark pants. His shoes, the ones that were half a size too small, polished with a rag and a dab of petroleum jelly, because Mabel had shown him that trick when he asked how to make old shoes look respectable. His backpack was on the floor between his feet. Inside the backpack was the composition book. The hearing began at 9:15. Hadley opened his folder. He spoke the way that systems speak when they are functioning as designed, with clarity and order and an absence of emotion that was itself a kind of statement. He described the case. A 7-year-old male ward of the county currently in an informal placement with a 71-year-old female caregiver who was not licensed by the state. A foster care application had been submitted by one Beckett Allen Greer, 48 leader of a motorcycle organization called the Ridgeline Riders, unmarried, no prior parenting experience. He listed his concerns. The applicant's military record indicated an other than honorable discharge resulting from a physical assault on a superior officer. The applicant's social network consisted of members of a motorcycle organization outside conventional community structures. The minor's current caregiver had been the victim of a sustained financial exploitation during which she had concealed the situation from her supervising social services coordinator. The resolution had been conducted through the independent action of the motorcycle organization rather than through proper channels. Based on these factors, he said, it is my preliminary recommendation that the minor be relocated to the licensed group care facility in Knoxville. He closed his folder. He folded his hands on top of it. He waited. Lorene stood. She presented the documentation. Beckett's completed certification training 30 hours passed with full marks. His background check clean. His home inspection passed. His employment record 14 years at the same shop. 3 character references from non-club members. She described the work the Ridgeline Riders had done on Mabel's house. She had photographs, before and after. 200 hours of labor donated without compensation. She described the relationship between Beckett and Silas. 9 months of observation. The salute. The gradual building of trust. The morning on the porch when Beckett found the boy alone. Mr. Hadley, she said. This man did not apply to be a foster parent because he was looking for a project. He applied because a boy stood on a porch for 8 months saluting him. And when that porch was empty, he was the only person in this town who stopped. Hadley wrote a note on his legal pad. I appreciate the context, Ms. Pace, but context is not criteria. Sentiment is not a standard. He turned to the room. I would like to hear from any additional parties who wish to speak to the matter. Silence. The silence of a room full of people deciding whether to stand up. Virgil Coulter stood first. He was not a man built for public speaking. He was a man built for engines and axles and the underside of vehicles. He stood with his hands at his sides and spoke the way he worked carefully without wasted motion. He produced a stack of photographs and set them in front of Hadley. Before and after. The roof line, the porch, the fence, the garden. This is what the house looked like when nobody was paying attention, he said. When the system was sending callbacks to wrong numbers and leaving a 7-year-old boy alone for 2 days without anyone noticing. He pointed to the after photographs. This is what the house looked like after 8 men on motorcycles spent 200 hours fixing it. Because a boy needed help and we were there, and that is what you do. He looked at Hadley. You can put that in your file. He sat down. Virgil's wife stood next. Her name was June. She was 63 and had the calm, practical bearing of a woman who had spent 30 years growing vegetables and had no patience for abstractions when concrete facts were available. I taught the boy to plant tomatoes, she said. He was on his knees in the dirt for 2 hours. He asked me about soil acidity and spacing and whether the plants could feel it when you moved them from the pot to the ground. He asked every question like the answer really mattered to him. I have raised 2 boys of my own. I know what it looks like when a child is learning how to belong somewhere. That boy is learning how to belong. She sat down. Then a woman in the back row stood up. She had not been expected. She had not been invited. She had driven herself to Harlan County that morning in a 15-year-old sedan with a cracked windshield and a passenger seat covered in flour dust. Her name was Fay Hollis. She was 68 years old. She ran the diner on Maple Street. She had been running it for 29 years. In all of those years she had never once spoken to any member of the Ridgeline Riders beyond taking their occasional breakfast order, which was rare because they understood that their presence made other customers uncomfortable. Fay stood with her apron still on because she had come directly from the morning shift and had not thought to remove it. Her hands were red from dishwater. My name is Fay Hollis. I run the diner on Maple Street in Calder Falls. I am not here for the bikers. I do not know them personally. She paused. But my diner has a window that faces Birch Street, and for 8 months every Tuesday and Thursday morning I watched that little boy stand on that porch and salute those men as they rode past. 8 months. In the rain, in the cold, in February when the frost was still on the ground and that child was standing out there in bare feet. Her voice shifted, deeper. The frequency of someone speaking from a place that is below performance and below preparation, from the place where truth lives before it has been organized into argument. And I watched this whole town do nothing. I watched the neighbors walk past that house and not stop. I watched the school bus pick him up and drop him off, and nobody asked why his shoes were too small or why he was thinner every month. I watched myself do nothing. I served coffee and pie and looked out my window and told myself it was not my business. She looked at Hadley. Those men on motorcycles are the only people in that town who slowed down. They are the only ones who noticed. And when the porch was empty, they are the only ones who stopped. Not me, not the neighbors, not the school, not your department, Mr. Hadley. Them. She sat down. The room was very quiet. The clock on the wall ticked 4 minutes behind the truth. Hadley wrote on his legal pad. He looked up. I appreciate the testimony. He turned to Beckett. Mr. Greer, I have a question regarding your military discharge. Your record indicates that you physically assaulted a superior officer during your second deployment to Iraq. Can you explain the circumstances? Beckett was quiet for a moment. He had known this question was coming. He had thought about it every day for 2 weeks. He opened his mouth, but before he could answer, Wyatt Maddox stood up. Wyatt was not a man who stood up in rooms. He was a man who leaned against fence posts and sat on motorcycles and occupied spaces with the quiet economy of someone who preferred to observe. He had been with Beckett longer than anyone. He was the only person alive who knew the full story, and he had kept it because Beckett had asked him to, and because he understood that the story belonged to someone else. But some things Wyatt had decided that morning while shaving in front of a mirror in Calder Falls are more important than the promises you make to protect other people's privacy. Some things become more important when a 7-year-old boy's future depends on them. My name is Wyatt Maddox, he said. I served with Beckett Greer during his second deployment to Iraq. I was present on the night of the incident that resulted in his discharge. I would like to tell you what happened. Hadley looked at him, nodded. There was a private in our unit, Wyatt said. 19 years old, a kid from Ohio who had enlisted because he did not have money for college and because his father had served and because he believed the way 19-year-olds believe things that the military would give him a direction. The staff sergeant assigned to our section had been abusing this private for weeks, not in public, not where anyone with rank could see. In the spaces between. After lights out. In storage rooms, in the motor pool when the rest of the unit was at chow. He hit the kid. He humiliated him. He did things that I am not going to describe in this room because the details are not the point. The point is that a 19-year-old boy was being systematically broken by a man who had power over him and who used that power because he could and because nobody stopped him. Wyatt's voice was level. The levelness was not calm. It was control, and it cost something to maintain. Beckett reported it. Twice. Through proper channels. The reports were acknowledged. No action was taken. The staff sergeant was well connected. His evaluations were clean. The system protected the system. The third time Beckett found the kid in a storage room at 0200 hours. He had a broken rib. He had blood coming from his ear. He was sitting on the concrete floor against a wall and he was not making any sound. He had stopped making sounds weeks earlier because he had learned that sounds did not produce help. Wyatt paused. Beckett put the staff sergeant on the ground. 2 punches. He broke the man's jaw. The staff sergeant was transferred to another unit. The private was sent home with a medical discharge and a flag on his record that ensured he would receive VA benefits for the rest of his life. And Beckett Greer was court-martialed and given an other than honorable discharge because the United States Army does not have a code for doing the right thing when the right thing requires you to hit a man who outranks you. He looked at Hadley. He never told anyone, not because he was ashamed, because the private asked him not to. The kid did not want his name attached to what happened to him. Beckett respected that. He carried the discharge for 6 years. He let people see the record and form their conclusions, and he never once explained because explaining would have meant telling someone else's story without their permission. Wyatt sat down. The room was silent. The silence had weight now, the specific gravity of something that has been concealed for a long time. and that once revealed changes the shape of everything around it. Hadley looked at his legal pad. He had stopped writing. His pen was resting on the paper at an angle that suggested he had set it down without deciding, to the involuntary gesture of a man whose process has encountered something that the process was not designed to accommodate. He looked at Beckett. "Mr. Greer, is this account accurate?" "It is." "And you chose not to disclose this during the application process." "I chose not to disclose it because the private asked me not to tell his story. That has not changed. Wyatt made his own decision today." Hadley was quiet. The clock ticked. The crepe myrtles outside the window moved slightly in a wind that no one inside the room could feel. Then a voice spoke from the second row. It was small, it was steady. It was the voice of a child who had spent 7 years learning that the most important things in the world are said quietly, without performance, without tears, in the plain language of facts that exist whether or not anyone is ready to hear them. "Can I say something?" Every head in the room turned. Silas Dawson was sitting in his chair with his hands on his knees, the same posture Beckett had adopted in the front row, a mirror so precise that several people in the room noticed it simultaneously and felt something tighten behind their ribs. Hadley looked at Laureen. Laureen nodded. "The boy may speak," Hadley said. Silas stood up. He reached down and unzipped his backpack and took out the composition book with the black and white marbled cover. He walked to the front of the room. His shoes, the ones that were half a size too small, made no sound on the oatmeal-colored carpet. He set the composition book on the table in front of Hadley. He did not open it. He did not read from it. He stood with his hands at his sides and looked at Warren Hadley with green eyes that were steady and clear, and that held in their quality of attention the accumulated evidence of a lifetime of watching adults to determine which ones could be trusted and which ones could not. "This is the notebook where I wrote down everything the man named Travis Keene did to Mabel," he said. "The dates, what he said, how much money he took. I kept it because I did not know what else to do, and I thought maybe if I wrote it down it would matter." He paused, not for effect, for breath. The breath of a child who is standing in a room full of adults and saying the most important thing he has ever said, and who understands with the clarity that children sometimes have when the stakes are absolute, that the next words out of his mouth may determine the shape of the rest of his life. "I have lived in a group home. I have lived with Mabel. And I have been on that porch for 8 months watching the road." He looked at Beckett, then back at Hadley. "I stood on that porch every Tuesday and Thursday for 8 months. In the cold, in the rain. When my feet were bare and my shoes were too small and I did not have enough to eat because a man was taking Mabel's money and she would not tell anyone because she was afraid they would take me away. I stood on that porch and I saluted those men because they were the only people I could see who moved through the world together without being afraid and without making anyone else afraid." His voice did not waver. It did not rise. It maintained the flat, measured quality of someone who has rehearsed, not the words, but the control required to say them. "And when Mabel got sick and I was alone for 2 days and nobody came, Mr. Beckett was the one who stopped. Not the neighbors, not the school, not your office." He looked at Hadley. "I have been waiting on that porch for 8 months for someone to stop." He stopped. "Please do not make me wait again." The room did not move. Fay Hollis was pressing her apron against her eyes. June Coulter had her hand on Virgil's arm. Laureen was looking at the table. Mabel was looking at her boy standing alone at the front of a room full of adults. saying the things she had never been able to say, with a courage she recognized because she had seen it before in the hallway of the yellow house on the night the ambulance came in. A child standing in pajamas watching the only person he trusted being carried out on a stretcher and not making a single sound. Hadley was looking at the composition book on the table in front of him. He had not opened it. He did not need to. The boy who had written it was standing in front of him, and the boy was the evidence. The fact that a 7-year-old child had sat in a closet and listened to a man threaten his caregiver, and had responded not with tears or with silence, but with a pencil and a notebook and a decision to walk 3 miles down a county road at dusk to find the one person he believed would know what to do. Something shifted behind Hadley's eyes, not dramatically, not visibly to most people in the room, but perceptibly to Lorene, who had been watching his face for the past hour, the way a navigator watches the sky, reading the small movements for signs of change. He turned to Beckett. "Mr. Greer," he said, "I have one more question." He pointed to Beckett's left forearm. The sleeve of the dark-collared shirt had ridden up slightly during the hearing, and beneath the cuff, visible in the fluorescent light, was the edge of a tattoo. Letters. Small. Partially obscured by other ink, but legible if you knew what you were looking at. "The name on your arm," Hadley said. "Below the others. Liam. Who is that?" The room went still, the stillness that precedes something that cannot be taken back. Beckett looked at his forearm. He looked at the letters he had carried for 6 years. He looked at the name of his son, written in ink on his skin, because ink does not leave, and because he needed to know that at least this much would stay with him for as long as his body lasted. Wyatt shifted in his chair. He was the only one in the room who knew what was coming, and his hands were gripped together between his knees with the force of a man who is holding himself in place. Beckett looked at Hadley. He looked at Silas. He looked at the composition book on the table, and the boy who had written it, and the green eyes that were watching him now with the same careful, measuring attention they had shown him on the porch 8 months ago, the first morning, the morning of the salute. He spoke. "Liam was my son." His voice was steady. It was steady the way the ground is steady after an earthquake, not because nothing has shifted, but because everything has shifted and the surface has decided to hold. "He was born when I was 28. His mother and I divorced when he was 8. She moved to North Carolina with the boy. I saw him on holidays and 3 weeks in the summer. I called him every Sunday evening at 7 o'clock, and we talked about whatever he wanted to talk about. School, video games, a girl he liked in the 8th grade, normal things, father and son things." He paused. The pause was for the gathering of something that had been stored in a deep place for a very long time and that required effort to bring to the surface. He was a quiet boy. I told myself that was fine. I told myself quiet was just the way he was. Some boys are loud and some boys are quiet, and the quiet ones are okay, because they are thinking and processing and they will talk when they are ready. His voice did not crack, it did not strain, it maintained the level tone of a man who has carried this long enough that the carrying has become part of how he speaks, part of how he breathes. Part of the way his hands rest on his knees and his eyes focus on a point in the middle distance. He was 14 years old. He died on a Wednesday evening in November 6 years ago. He was alone in his bedroom. His mother found him. I received the phone call while I was riding Route 9 600 miles away. I pulled over on the shoulder of the road and I sat on my motorcycle and I did not move for a long time. He looked at his forearm. I did not hear him. That is the thing I have carried every day for 6 years. I called every Sunday. I listened. I asked the right questions. And I did not hear him. I did not hear the silence underneath the silence. I did not hear what the quiet actually meant. I told myself it was fine, and it was not fine, and by the time I understood that my son was gone, he looked at Silas. I am not telling you this because I want sympathy, Mr. Hadley. I am telling you this because you asked who Liam was, and the answer to that question is the answer to every other question you have about why I am sitting in this room. He turned back to Hadley. I could not save my son. I did not hear him when he needed me to hear him. And I have spent 6 years riding down a road 2 days a week past a yellow house where a 7-year-old boy stood on a porch and saluted me, and I did not stop. For 8 months I did not stop. I slowed down. I saluted back. I noticed his shoes were too small and his feet were bare, and he was thin, and there were no other adults in sight. I noticed all of it. And I kept riding. His voice found something then. Not volume, not force. Something underneath both. And then one morning the porch was empty. And I stopped. And I swore to myself on that porch that I would not ride past again. Not this time. Not with this boy. He placed his hand on the table. The way you place your hand on a surface when you need to feel something solid. I failed my son. I will not fail this one, not today, not ever. The room was silent. The fluorescent lights hummed. The clock ticked 4 minutes behind the truth. Outside the window, the crepe myrtles bent slightly in a wind that smelled like Tennessee summer, like warm asphalt and cut grass and the distant promise of rain. Warren Hadley sat at the front table and looked at the composition book and the man and the boy in the room full of people who had come because a child needed them and who had spoken because the truth required it. He looked at his legal pad, at the notes he had taken, at the categories and the criteria and the standards that he had brought with him from Knoxville in a leather briefcase that was now sitting at his feet like something that belonged to a version of this morning that no longer existed. He picked up his pen. He set it down again. He pressed his fingertips together in the way that people press their fingertips together when they are having a conversation with themselves that they are not yet ready to have in public. Then he closed his folder. He did not announce a decision. He did not make a speech. He looked at Laureen Pace and said in a voice that was quieter than any voice he had used that morning, a voice that was no longer the voice of a system, but the voice of a man who had been a father himself, and who understood perhaps for the first time in a long career of understanding processes that some things cannot be measured by the standards he had spent his life applying. I would like to take a 15-minute recess, he said. He left the room. He was gone for 12 minutes. When he returned, he sat down and opened his folder and wrote 3 sentences on a form that he signed and dated and pushed across the table to Laureen. The form recommended provisional foster placement of the minor child with Beckett Allen Greer pending completion of the standard 6-month evaluation period. It further recommended that the Department of Children's Services expedite the formal licensing application of Mabel Whitmore as a co-guardian, recognizing her documented history of care and the established bond between caregiver and child. In the notes section at the bottom of the form in handwriting that was precise and small and entirely legible, Warren Hadley wrote a single sentence. The child's own testimony and documented actions demonstrate a level of resilience, judgment, and attachment that this reviewer finds compelling and dispositive. He signed it. He pushed back his chair. He stood. He looked at Silas. The boy was still standing at the front of the room with his hands at his sides. "Young man," Hadley said, "you are a remarkable individual." He picked up his briefcase. He nodded to Lorene. He walked out of the room and down the hallway and through the front door and into the parking lot where the crepe myrtles were moving in the wind. He got into his car. He sat for a moment before starting the engine. Then he drove back to Knoxville on roads that were the same roads he had driven that morning, but that looked, for reasons he could not have articulated, slightly different in the afternoon light. Inside the hearing room, nobody moved for a long moment. Then Mabel stood up. She walked to the front of the room. She stood in front of Silas and looked down at him, and he looked up at her, and what passed between them was the thing itself. The thing that language points toward but never quite reaches. The thing that a 71-year-old woman with a bad heart and a 7-year-old boy with a composition book had built between them over 14 months of cornbread and library books and lavender soap, and the quiet mutual understanding that they were each of them the only person the other one had. She put her hand on his head. He leaned into it. That was all. That was enough. Beckett stood. He walked to them. He did not kneel. He did not crouch. He stood at his full height and looked at the boy and the woman, and he placed one hand on Mabel's shoulder and the other on the back of Silas's neck, the way you place your hand on something you intend to hold, and the three of them stood there in the fluorescent light of a county services building on a Wednesday morning in July, while the clock on the wall ticked 4 minutes behind the truth, and the world outside continued in the way that the world continues, indifferent and enormous and unconcerned with the small arrangements that people make inside of it to keep each other safe. The Ridgeline riders filed out of the room quietly. Virgil held the door for June. Jasper carried Silas's backpack. Wyatt walked beside Beckett without speaking because there was nothing to say that the morning had not already said. In the parking lot in the shade of the crepe myrtles, Silas looked up at Beckett. "Can we go home now?" he said. Beckett looked at him. At the white shirt and the two small shoes and the green eyes and the careful self-possession and the way the boy stood straight back, chin level, the posture of a child who had been practicing how to stand at attention for 8 months on a porch in Tennessee, because he believed that the men who rode past him deserved it. "Yeah," Beckett said, "we can go home." They went home. The rest of the summer unfolded in the way that good things unfold when they have been earned, not quickly, not dramatically, in the small, steady accumulation of ordinary days that build one on top of another into something that holds. Mabel completed her formal foster care licensing on the 1st of August. Lorene processed the application with characteristic efficiency and noted in her file that the residence was in excellent repair and that the primary caregiver had demonstrated consistent commitment to the child's stability and welfare. The co-guardianship was formalized the following week. 2 names on 1 document, Mabel Whitmore and Beckett Greer. 2 people who had arrived at the same child from different directions and who had decided separately and together that this boy was theirs. Silas's shoes were replaced, properly fitted, half a size larger than his actual measurement because Virgil's wife said boys that age grow fast and it was better to have room. Silas tried them on in the store and walked 3 laps around the display aisle and looked down at his feet with an expression that Beckett recognized from somewhere deep and far away, the expression of someone encountering a basic comfort for the first time and discovering that it changes the way you stand in the world. They were just shoes, but they were shoes that fit. And for a boy who had spent a year walking on his toes because complaining did not produce solutions, shoes that fit were not just shoes. They were evidence that someone was paying attention. On a Saturday morning in the last week of August, the Ridgeline riders gathered behind Virgil's shop for their regular ride, and for the first time Silas Dawson was among them. He sat on the back of Beckett's motorcycle. His helmet was fitted and buckled, a child's helmet that Jasper had ordered online 3 weeks earlier, without telling anyone the way Jasper did things that mattered quietly, without announcement, with the understanding that the gesture was the point and the recognition was unnecessary. Silas wore a child-sized riding vest, leather, with the Ridgeline Riders patch on the back. Jasper had ordered that too. The group rode south out of Calder Falls toward the county line on a route that had been quietly adjusted to pass twice down Birch Street. On the second pass, Mabel Whitmore was standing on the porch. She had been told to expect them. She was wearing the blue dress with the small white flowers. Her hair was combed and pinned. She stood at the top of the new porch steps with her hand on the railing that Wyatt had built, and her garden green behind her, and the gutters clean and straight above her, and the house that she had almost lost, standing solid and repaired around her. As the column came around the bend near the old grain elevator and the yellow house came into view, Silas Dawson raised his right hand in a salute. Not from the porch this time. From the back of a motorcycle. Straight backed, chin level, arm bent at the precise angle he had practiced for a year on a cold porch in socks and bare feet and two small shoes, offered with the full and deliberate ceremony of a boy who understood that some gestures mean more when the position you make them from has changed. Mabel raised her hand in return. She held it until the column passed. Her hand trembled. She did not lower it until the last motorcycle disappeared around the far curve, and then she stood on the porch for a long time with her hand still raised. Not because the riders were still visible, but because some gestures once begun deserved to be held for longer than the moment that inspired them. Beckett kept his eyes on the road. He kept his hands steady on the throttle. He felt the weight of the boy on the seat behind him, small and warm and entirely present, leaning forward slightly into the wind, the way new riders do when they begin to understand what the road offers. Not speed, not escape, something else. The feeling of moving through the world with people who have chosen to ride beside you. The feeling of belonging to a column that slows when you slow and stops when you stop and does not leave you behind. The engine held its low and steady note beneath them. The tires read the road the way they were made to. The column moved together down Route 9 through the green Tennessee morning, 8 motorcycles and 1 small passenger, and the sound of them rolled out across the valley and up toward the ridge where the tree line was full and dark against the August sky. 20 years later, a man with gray in his beard rides at the head of a column of motorcycles through a small town in western Tennessee. He is 27 years old. His build is lean, his eyes green, his posture straight in the saddle with the discipline of someone who learned very young how to stand at attention and never entirely stopped. The column moves through the town on a county road that passes a row of houses with porches that face the morning. The man is not looking for anything in particular. He is riding the way he has ridden every week for most of his adult life, with the unhurried confidence of someone who understands that the road is not a destination but a practice, a way of moving through the world that requires the presence of others to be complete. He sees the boy, small, maybe 6 or 7, standing on the top step of a porch that needs paint, wearing a shirt that is too big and shoes that might be too small. The boy is watching the motorcycles pass with an expression that the man recognizes immediately and completely. because he wore that expression once on a different porch in a different town a lifetime ago. The boy raises his hand. The man squeezes the brake. The column slows. He pulls onto the shoulder. The engines go quiet one by one. He swings off the bike. He walks back toward the house. The boy is still standing on the porch with his hand raised. The man raises his hand in return. A full salute, straight-backed, chin level, the same salute he learned from a war documentary on a Sunday afternoon in a yellow house on Birch Street. The same salute he gave from the back of a motorcycle on an August morning while a woman in a blue dress watched from a porch with tears on her face and her hand in the air. On the man's left forearm, visible below the rolled cuff of his sleeve, two names are tattooed in small, careful letters, one above the other. Liam. Mabel. He walks up the path toward the porch. The boy lowers his hand. He looks up at the man with the measuring expression of a child who has been watching the world for a long time and is still deciding what to make of it. The man sits down on the porch step. He does not rush. He does not reach. He sits the way Beckett Greer taught him to sit, beside a frightened child, low and still, with his hands visible and his voice easy, making himself small enough to be safe and steady enough to be trusted. Behind him the riders lean against their bikes and wait. They have learned to read his pace the way they learned to read it through years of formation, riding through years of trusting each other on the road. When he slows, they slow. When he stops, they stop. The boy on the porch looks at the man on the steps. The man on the steps looks at the boy on the porch. And the road behind them is long and quiet and patient, the way roads are patient, holding the distance between where you have been and where you are going, asking nothing, offering everything, waiting for you to decide which direction matters most. Some debts are not paid in grand gestures. They are paid in ordinary ones, in a repaired gutter and a painted room and a pair of shoes that fit. In a composition book filled with the careful handwriting of a child who believed that writing things down could change the world and turned out to be right. In a name tattooed on an arm. In a salute held across 20 years and 600 miles and the entire length of a life that almost did not happen. In a man who stopped. And a boy who was waiting.